vehemently that Chris Braithwaite, which is the latest publication from the Socialist Society. If you're in London on February the 18th, Tuesday, February the 18th, the launch with the author will be at 6:30 at the Bookmarks Bookshop, which is 1 Bloomsbury Street, West Central 1.
That's right, yeah.
So, anyone in London fancy going along, 6:30, Bookmarks,
Lots of
Tuesday.
wine. Lots of wine.
That's right, you're going lots of wine.
Very close to the wine, but you get your money back if you buy a book.
Oh, that's how it works.
The book's only 4 quid.
Since the book's only 4 quid, it's less than you pay for the wine.
Is this the time for announcing the Roman press?
No, we can do that tomorrow, can't we?
Okay, well, if you have your attention please, it's my great pleasure to chair this last panel for today. I think we'll all agree it's been a very stimulating and enlightening first day. I'm Rory. I'm a PhD student here in the School of History. Just before we start, I've written up the addresses for tonight's arrangements, so if anybody fancies a free curry beer, glass of wine, go into the King's Head on Magdalen Street at 6:45, and then we'll head over just over the road to Ali Tandoori Curry. So depending on the arrangements, you can meet us at either one of the two. So without further ado, I'll introduce Robert Brier from the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, who's going to be talking to us about nationalism and international society, the Polish question, the politics of representation at the Second International.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks also for organizing this wonderful conference. I'm very excited to be here because this is actually the first time that I'm going to speak about this research project in the context of labor history, or the history of the workers' movement. Because the starting point of this research project was actually a broader observation about the 19th century as a time which was simultaneously a time of rising nationalism, an age of blood and iron even, as well as the first golden age of internationalism. Numerous international organizations were formed in the last decades of the 19th century, and dozens of international congresses were held codifying international law or setting international standards of scientific validity or artistic excellence. And the Second International is, of course, an organization which embodies this contradiction or seeming contradiction between nationalism and internationalism, formed to promote international solidarity among workers. It practically collapsed in 1914 when its most important member parties anyway succumbed to nationalist sentiments supporting their respective governments or war. Now I think as historians there may be two ways of interpreting this relationship between nationalism and internationalism. Some scholars see World War I as merely a temporary setback for the inevitable rise of a global civil society in the early 21st century, which one day will replace the nation state. A second view holds that late 19th century internationalism can actually be dismissed as a mere side note to the emergence of a Byzantine world of self-interested nation states. Now both of these views actually see nationalism and internationalism as two contradictory developments or forces. And in this paper I want to suggest the more complex reading of the relationship between these two dimensions. 19th century internationalism was certainly an attempt to establish a world of peacefully coexisting nations. Through its politics of membership and its symbolism of representation, however, it may nevertheless have contributed to establishing an international mode of legitimacy centered around state sovereignty and thus also around, or in its consequences also, around nationhood. In my paper I have a longer theoretical section in which I discuss a few approaches to this. I'll spare you this and refer you to the paper which is online, and jump right into my empirical case study, and that is the Polish question as the Second International. Now the Polish question, that is to say the question of how to respond to the dissolution, if you will, of the Polish Gentry Republic in the late 18th century. The Polish question was at the center of 19th century international history, and it was particularly important for the history of socialism. Wherever a revolutionary movement existed through most of the epoch that ended in 1918, Poles were in the midst of it, writes G.D.H. Cole in his history of socialist thought. And in 1896, Karl Kautsky wrote that the Polish question actually stood at the cradle of the International. The oppression of an uprising, the January uprising in Russian partition of Poland, was one of the reasons for the formation of the Internationalism, First International in 1864. Now, the Polish question may actually also seem to embody this contradiction between nationalism and internationalism. The continuous importance of the Polish question throughout the 19th century ties in with a certain account of Polish history as actually a constant struggle against oppression, and the fact that in the late 19th century, with the Polish Socialist Party, a group emerged within the Second International that made national independence its main goal, and may be seen as kind of nationalism intruding into this international body. However, despite its ongoing significance throughout the entire century, the precise meaning of what actually the Polish question was about underwent a profound transformation during the 19th century. For Polish nationalists itself, until the January uprising of 1863, the rebuilding of the Polish state was seen as the result of a revolutionary act. So it was not necessarily based in its early stages on the idea of an ethnic group which had a universal right to self-determination. At the international level, the Polish question was initially discussed in terms of state sovereignty and international politics. Re-establishing an independent Polish state was intended to recalibrate, as it were, a system of sovereign states that had been thrown off balance when one of its members had disappeared from the map of Europe. So again, it was more about a state, group of sovereign state, and not about a universal right of culturally defined entities to determine its own fate. In the socialist movement, finally, support for the Polish question was largely a tactical, strategic question. Marx and Engels had hoped that re-establishing a Polish state would weaken both Russia and Tsarist the most reactionary forces, and thus create a positive environment for the emergence of an East European working class. And if we go beyond this and actually look at the relationship between Polish socialism and its struggle for independence, we also get an even more complex picture, because after the January uprising in the second half of the 1860s, 1870s, well into the 1880s, leading Polish socialists were actually not so keen about turning Polish independence into the main aim of Polish socialism. At the 50th anniversary of the 1830 uprising, the so-called November uprising, Marx and Engels set a note of solidarity, saying that the call, long live Poland, should again be at the center of the socialist movement, and caused no small embarrassment actually on the Polish socialists who had to come to believe that this slogan, long live Poland, had become the black banner of the reaction, and that Polish independence should best be sought under the banner proletarians of the world united. For them, the question of Polish independence became subordinate to the question of nationalism. And even after the formation of the PPS in 1891 as a socialist party which focused mainly on Polish independence, the relationship still was more complicated than it may seem. One of the most important intellectual figures of early intellectual figures of this PPS, the émigré Kazimierz Kraus, did want to make Polish independence the central aim, but for him, the rebuilding of the Polish state was still seen in a socialist context. It was seen as a necessary precondition for political democracy, which he then saw as a necessary precondition of socialism. So for him, nationalism was actually a vehicle for the establishment of a socialist state, not the central aim. So the point here is to underline that there was no the turn of Polish socialists towards nationalism, struggling mainly for Polish independence, was not at all inevitable. It did not follow from some kind of logic of 19th century Polish history. If we now move to the level of the Second International itself, I think we also encounter a much more complicated relationship between nationalism and internationalism than a more superficial view might suggest. And until when was the bureau of the Second International Congress? Sometime in the early 20th century. Until this bureau was founded, the Second International existed mainly in its congresses that were held a couple of years. And if you look at the symbolism of these kinds of congresses, it turns out that the symbolism was clearly meant to convey the sense of labor internationalism, of workers uniting for their common cause. At the Congress in London in 1892, the Congress's board of bureau was located in the orchestra room of Queen's Hall. There was a picture of Karl Marx displayed next to the bureau, so the founding father was symbolically presiding over this meeting. There was a big banner, proletarians of the world unites, the Marseillaise or something. The idea was, that people from different nations come together to fight for a common cause. However, the meeting itself was divided into specific national delegations. Initially, the reason for dividing the meeting into, or actually every Congress into national delegations was more practical. It was believed that the credentials of movements or groups, organizations coming to this Congress would best be checked within people coming from the same country. That was why they were divided into these national delegations. But judging from the protocols, it seems to me that these delegations actually played a much more important role. Votes were often taken by national delegations, not simply by heads of people attending it. And speakers in their statements would often pose as representatives of a national labor. I have a very telling quote of Victor Adler from the Congress in Zurich in 1893 in the paper. So the unity displayed at the Socialist Congresses was a unity of distinct national delegations. The German protocol of the London Congress even speaks of delegates of the individual nations. And this division was kept up, even though it at times may actually have been more practical that people, that every delegate vote, as the French example shows, which was notoriously marked by internal conflicts. And this division of the Congresses into international delegations set the parameters of the discussion of the Polish question at the Congress in London, and especially a clash between the two major orientations within Polish socialism. Klaus, whom I already mentioned, had convinced the other members of the PPS to submit a motion to the Congress that the Congress would endorse Polish national independence as in the interest of the international proletariat. This prompted Rosa Luxemburg to publish a series of articles, especially in German socialist papers, arguing against this motion, arguing that it is actually in the interest of submitting her own counter resolution to London, saying that the Congress should decide that it's actually in the interest of the international proletariat, that the Polish workers within Tsarist Russia unite with the other workers and struggle against Tsarism rather than for national independence. So the two main orientations within Polish socialism clashed. Now, if you look at how Luxemburg made her point, there's not the slightest of doubt that she was a Marxist and she was speaking from a Marxist position. At some point, she even told a friend that in the Polish question, it's important to out-Marx Marx, so to be even more Marxist than Marx himself. She submitted a report to the London Congress on behalf of her party, the SDKP. That was a strongly historically materialist analysis of the proletariat situation in Russian Poland. Her mandate to speak at the Socialist Congress, however, was based on her claim to speak on behalf of a significant section of the Polish labor movement. And this was actually one of the ways in which the PPS tried to battle her counter-resolution, by trying to deny her a mandate to speak on behalf of the Polish working class, to exclude her from the Polish delegation at the London Congress. The report which Luxemburg submitted to the London Congress also had a clearly national horizon in that it invoked the interests of the Polish workers within the Tsarist Empire rather than those of the entire working class in this country. And when it came to Polish independence, finally, she did not outrightly reject the importance of Polish independence, but rather said that it's unrealistic to demand Polish independence at this time. Indeed, the core of her counter-resolution was to argue that the most effective means of gaining national liberation is the strengthening of the international solidarity of workers. So she too was arguing actually that she was for independence, she was just advocating a more effective way of achieving. The outcome of this, the point about Luxemburg, wrap up this point about Luxemburg. So even kind of an ardent internationalist and Marxist like Luxemburg was, by the way in which legitimacy was the way that the International Congress legitimated people to speak there, forced to submit to a mode of representation which was centered around nations and national identity. The conflicts between these two resolutions was not really resolved. None of these two resolutions was adopted by the Congress. Instead, the relevant commission drafted kind of a compromise formulation, and I'll quote this one in full. The Congress declares in favor of the full autonomy of all nationalities and its sympathy with the workers of any country at present suffering under the yoke of military, national, or other despotisms. And the Congress calls upon the workers in all such countries to fall into line side by side with the class-conscious workers of the world, to organize for the overthrow of international capitalism and the establishment of international social democracy. This compromise formulation then left most questions in the intra-Polish conflict unanswered. Neither did it endorse or reject Polish independence. It didn't resolve the dispute over the strategy of the Polish labor movement, whether it should seek independence or cooperate with the Russian working class or the other working class in the Tsarist Empire. Nor did it make a decision on the relative importance of the national question as compared to the international struggle with capitalism. It did, however, endorse the right of all nationalities to autonomy. The wording of the Polish and German versions were even stronger, speaking of nations and, more than 20 years before either Lenin or Wilson, granting them the full right to self-determination. Also volles Selbstbestimmungsrecht aller Nationen was the German term. That's actually very strong endorsement of saying that nations have the right to self-determination. So it had started out as a debate over re-establishing a previously existing member of the community of sovereign states, combined with a second internationalist politics of recognition and representation, to produce the declaration of a universal right of nations to self-determination. Now, no subsequent Congress took up this issue of national self-determination, but I do think this resolution did set a precedent for other groups within, especially from East Central Europe, from these multinational East Central European empires, to also claim separate representation at the congresses of the Second International. The Poles had a separate representation, had their own national delegation, kind of out of tradition, because the Poles had always been active in the labor movement. And now, for instance, the Czechs or the Armenians within the Tsarist Empire began to demand their own national delegations at these congresses. And this set in motion a process or a discussion in the Second International, especially as it tried to institutionalize its structures by founding this international bureau in Brussels, and I simply cannot remember when exactly it was established, about who actually has the right to speak at the Second International, and also about what a national delegation and what a nation is. And the attempt by the leading groups within the Second International was to come up with a definition of nationhood that was political. So at some point the suggestion was that national delegations were groups of workers that were struggling against one and the same government. So it was not any more cultural criterion that was supposed to define a national delegation, but a political one. However, these, especially the Polish and the Czech delegation, who already had separate delegations, rebelled against this and opposed against this because it would have deprived them of their own separate delegation at the Bureau and the Congresses. And so in this context, the representative of the PPS, Hermann Diermann, argued, I quote, "We Poles do not constitute a state, we constitute a nation, and we have a right to be separately represented at the Bureau and the Congress." And the final decision was actually to grant some groups, such as the Czechs and the Poles, their own delegations. But the point here is that while this suggestion of defining the nation politically was a clear attempt to encourage socialist parties to unite and to focus on the struggle for socialism, it actually produced the opposite effect. The Poles and the Czechs' mandate in the Bureau, it may have actually pushed them towards the very understanding of an ethnic nation that the Commission had intended to dismiss. And so this is kind of the example of this more complex relationship between nationalism and internationalism, and the question of how the world was actually imagined at these congresses, and the specific way in which it was imagined may have actually led the Poles to endorse nationalism, may have been contributing factor to argue more cautiously to endorse national independence, and not some kind of inevitable national characteristic to drive for independence. Thanks.
Great. Well, with our tried and tested formula, we'll take questions after both the papers. So I'd like to ask Axel Verschuss from State University of New York at Potsdam to talk to us about between internationalism, nationalism and betrayal, East and West German debates on the labour movement in Imperial Germany.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's probably somewhat confusing for some people when I mentioned Potsdam before. It does not refer to Potsdam next to Berlin, but Potsdam in New York State, which is a small college town, roughly between Ottawa and Montreal, but on the American side. So, in any event, in an interesting way, history happens at least twice, not only in the sense of Marx and Hegel's famous statement about at first as a tragedy and then as a farce, but also in terms of the actual events, and then later on historians trying to understand the events and reimagining them. And in my case it happens sort of 3 times, in as much as my paper focuses on how East and West German historians, mainly in the 1950s and 60s, have imagined and debated working class internationalism as well as nationalism, particularly within the case of Germany. So what I would like to do first of all is provide a brief introduction to the Cold War context, and then deal with my main argument, my thesis, and then flesh things out a little bit. The title is Between Internationalism, Nationalism and Betrayal, East and West German Debates on the Labor Movement in Imperial Germany, in particular related to the question of, how and why did the German Social Democratic Party and the labor movement ultimately fall over and support the imperial government in the summer of 1914. And how these debates worked out in East and West Germany. So the Cold War obviously took place between East and West Germany, specifically 1949 and 1989, and East and West Germany were particularly volatile places inasmuch as both countries very much depended on their imperial masters, West Germany, the United States, East Germany, the Soviet Union. They try to present themselves, of course, as sort of the teacher's pets and being very loyal followers of their respective spheres of influence. And East and West Germany also competed over who represented the better Germany, the more democratic, the more socially just Germany. So this competition between East and West Germany was a competition not only in political and economic terms, it was also fought among historians, East and West German historians, and they focused especially on key issues like the causes of World War I and World War II, the various roles of social classes, of particular individuals, particular politicians like Kaiser Wilhelm and the Chancellor von Holding and so on and so forth, and the question of how widespread nationalism, chauvinist nationalism was, even among the working class, and how much it was counteracted by internationalist sensibilities. And while I prepared this paper, by the way, before I forget, I have a little outline here. Pass this around. While I prepared this paper, I sort of developed the somewhat counterintuitive argument that the most interesting work, especially in the 1950s, regarding this question was done in East Germany as opposed to West Germany, even though the environment for scholars was more controlled and regimented in East Germany. There was, relatively speaking, more academic freedom in West Germany. And concerning East German historiography, I looked especially at the case of a very interesting and complex and contradictory and eccentric historian, the case of Jürgen Kuczynski and his famous book, Der Ausbruch des Ersten Weltkrieges und die deutsche Sozialdemokratie, the outbreak of World War I and German social democracy, the book that came out in 1957. And while this book, of course, was in many ways a child of its time, it nevertheless posed important questions and jump-started debates in East Germany and in West Germany in terms of historiography. And thus the response to this book in East and West Germany sort of underscores how ideologically loaded and bitterly contested those questions were, especially in the 1950s and 60s. What I would like to do now is take a brief look at sort of major developments and issues in East and West Germany in the 50s and early 60s. In West Germany, of course, we have Chancellor Konrad Adenauer with his agenda of integrating West Germany within the American system. We have an attempt to sort of rehabilitate the nationalist tradition. At the same time, we have the development of the social market economy. We have the so-called Hallstein doctrine, which essentially posed the idea that West Germany is the only legitimate representative of Germany and Germanness, and any country that has diplomatic relations with East Germany cannot have diplomatic relations with West Germany at the same time. And there was the issue of rearmament, West Germany eventually down the road joining NATO, and so on and so forth. In East Germany, you have perhaps even more complex and potentially volatile situation, in as much as you have the government of Walter Ulbricht, who has to consolidate his power and authority because he experienced several significant challenges to his government. He has the support of Moscow, of course, but there were within the East German Socialist Unity Party alternative currents represented by people such as Wilhelm Zeiser, for example, former Minister of State Security, or Rudolf Herrnstadt, an intellectual and editor-in-chief of the party paper Neues Deutschland. Later on you have Ernst Wollweber and Anton Ackermann as well, who represented the idea of a more German path to socialism as opposed to following the Soviet model. Then there's the famous case of Wolfgang Harich and his attempts to change the East German government and implement more independent from Moscow, independent socialist government. So the situation is quite volatile and defensive. And within the context of this struggle for identity and negotiating various challenges, you have historians debating these issues. For example, in West Germany, we have, by and large, tradition of nationalist historians who dominate the discourse in the 1950s. Friedrich Meinecke, for example, a more liberal, conservative nationalist. We have Gerhard Ritter, who is very interested in, of course, condemning Nazi Germany, but rehabilitating Prussia, rehabilitating the German conservative project. And we have Hans Rothfels as well, one of the few historians who, after exile in the United States during the Nazi years, was invited and willing to return to West Germany. He used to be, in some ways, almost on the far right, and eventually he moved into a more moderate conservative camp. In any event, these kinds of historians were not really interested in doing research on the working class per se and on issues of internationalism. The major focus was on rehabilitating the old nationalist tradition. There were also other historians, more liberal historians of German background who spent the Nazi years in exile. Erich Eyck, Hoyo Holborn, for example, Hans Rothfels, F.L. Carden, Franz Neumann as a sociologist, and others. But those kinds of people did not have any immediate impact on West German historiography in the 1950s, but they sort of prepared the way later on for the so-called Bielefeld school and individuals like Hans-Ulrich Wehler, Jürgen Kocher, and others. And there's also the influence of a more critical historical tradition that comes out of the Weimar Republic, represented by names such as Eckhard Kehr and Otto Rosenberg, and those people were definitely on the left and interested in the working class and try to understand why the working class movement was infiltrated by no small degree of nationalism in addition to their internationalist leanings. All right, to say something very briefly about the historiographic and scholarly context in East Germany, we have the attempt to create a new historical tradition characterized by anti-fascism and a strong and systematic critique of the German nationalist tradition and the way it was complicit in what eventually led to Nazism and anti-capitalism, and the attempt to establish a new Marxist-Leninist school of historical thought. Contrary to West Germany, East Germany actually was hospitable to and received quite a few historians who spent the Nazi years abroad, either in the United States or Great Britain. I want to just mention a few names. In addition to Jürgen Kuczynski, my major focus, Alfred Meusel, for example, and Hans Mottig. They were in British exile. Karl Obermann in the United States. Will Peltz probably knows Hans Obermann's famous book on Josef Weidemeyer and so on and so forth. Arnold Reisberg, Leo Stern, one could add Ernst Engelberg and Wolfgang Hugo was in a prison camp in the Soviet Union, but eventually he worked in East Germany. So in that sense, East Germany early on was open to a new historical tradition and new intellectual impulses, but all of this took place within the context of Marxism-Leninism. Marxism-Leninism as the official state doctrine / state religion that provided, well, in addition to serious scholarship, also pre-described answers and a pattern of how things ought to be interpreted. For example, the official Marxist-Leninist line on internationalism and nationalism in the German social democratic and working class movement prior to World War I was that the people, the rank and file workers, were of course agents of revolutionary change. They were instinctively internationalist and were unfortunately betrayed and misled by corrupt mainstream social democratic leadership in terms of the centrists around Kautsky and obviously also the revisionists around Bernstein. And then there was the heroic, if ultimately futile, struggle of people such as Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg and others in terms of warning about the dangers of nationalism, the dangers of accommodating too much to Imperial Germany, giving up the class struggle in favor of parliamentarism, and ultimately opposing any kind of compromise in terms of supporting the war effort. All right, so this is the official interpretation. I want to focus on how, especially in East Germany, that interpretation was both supported and challenged by, in particular, Jürgen Kuczynski. As mentioned before, one of the big figures of West German historiography was Gerhard Ritter, and his major focus was not the working class, and if he mentions the working class, it is within the context of Burgfriedenspolitik, the idea of circling the wagons and everyone supporting imperial policies, but he pays next to no attention to debates within the working class movement. In fact, in one of his major books, I think it is translated into English as The Sword, in the chapter I try to find references to Liebknecht and Luxemburg, and there were no references whatsoever. So the old generation of conservative historians is not interested in that subject matter. Nevertheless, there were two historians I want to mention in the West. Helga Grebing and her famous book about the German labor movement, and Wolfgang Abendroth. Now, Abendroth is not a historian but a political scientist, or he was a political scientist, and he was an outsider as well. He definitely was not part of the mainstream, and Abendroth was perhaps the most, in my opinion, most interesting in terms of looking at internationalist and nationalist currents within the working class movement prior to World War I in an empirical fashion. While Helga Grebing did, of course, very serious empirical work as well, but as supporter of the Social Democratic Party, she was quite anxious not to, in any sense, even inadvertently, support sort of the SED reading of history in terms of the Social Democratic Party having been betrayed by the mainstream party leadership and so on and so forth. So her main argument is this kind of nationalism was very widespread. In fact, it is no surprise that almost everyone fell prey to it, since you can see nationalist tendencies even in the writings of Marx and Engels. But she does not go into too much detail, and I think it is to a large extent because she is one at the same time committed to empirical research and to the ideological mission of sort of defending the Social Democratic Party and its tradition in post-war Germany, as well along the lines of we're essentially the reasonable and the moderate socialists, and if our people have made any mistakes, those were just, well, part of the spirit of the time, as opposed to something we should examine in a more critical fashion. Jürgen Kuczynski in East Germany presented the most, in my opinion, most intriguing critique and perspective on these dynamics of nationalism and internationalism in the working class movement. In 1957, he publishes his book about the outbreak of the war in German social democracy. And this is to be seen within the context of 1956 and Khrushchev's speech, the beginnings of de-Stalinization, a new atmosphere, the so-called thaw, and Kuczynski's hope that now is the time for, well, questioning old certainties. Not in the sense of giving up on Marxism-Leninism, because he saw himself until 1989 as a very loyal Marxist-Leninist, but in terms of fleshing it out more. He pointed out in this book that we Marxists, quote, we Marxists have the most coherent explanation of why crises happen in terms of economic crises, but we have done very little empirical work. Bourgeois historians actually have done much better empirical work on how these economic crises, these cyclical crises happen. So in his book, he tries to offer a lot of empirical information. His main argument is that nationalism was widespread, not just among the conservative spectrum and the liberal spectrum, but among the working class spectrum as well. It was widespread among the party leadership, it was widespread among rank and file workers, and it was something that was underestimated by the radical left, by Liebknecht, by Luxemburg, and even by Lenin. And then he tries to explore why that was the case, how Lenin, for example, and Luxemburg were aware of the dangers of petite bourgeois attitudes and the currents of revisionism, but they underestimated how a workers' aristocracy developed into party functionaries who made their home in Imperial Germany and eventually had a lot more to lose than just their chains. So in any event, if you read this book today, it doesn't really seem that controversial, but it was very controversial in 1957 because it very directly challenged the interpretive monopoly of the SED in terms of deciding what has happened in the past and how these kinds of developments should be assessed. So Kuczynski was attacked by all sorts of people, party officials such as Kurt Harger, fellow historians like Josef Schleifstein and Alfred Meusel, and he was forced to, well, distance himself from the book. They printed at first about 3,000 copies, about 1,500 copies were sold, the rest was destroyed, and Kuczynski was in real danger of losing his professorship because of this controversy. So ultimately he had to make enough compromises in order to maintain his position and influence, and especially protect his students, Helga Nussbaum and Wolfgang Jonas. He was very concerned that if he were to be expelled from academia, their future would be in danger as well. So Kuczynski said he may have exaggerated certain things, and of course it was wrong to point out how heroically the political left struggled in favor of maintaining an internationalist tradition, but he maintained that in essence it is not just the revisionists, it is not just the centrists, but it is the radical left as well that has failed in understanding how dangerous nationalism is and how over many years, if not decades, it has slowly undermined internationalist leanings. And thus his major message here is we have made mistakes. In order to be true to our self-understanding as Marxists, we have to confront them, we cannot belittle them, and we have to most of all do serious empirical research before we can engage in grand generalizations. And in terms of the consequences of Kuczynski's book, down the road he very much influenced a more nuanced approach in terms of East German historians who in several volumes later on looked at the origins of World War I and the working class movement. So Fritz Klein, for example, pointed out before he died, in hindsight again, how important Kuczynski's work was in order to jumpstart a more serious and critical scholarly tradition in East Germany, even within the context of Marxism, Leninism, maintaining a critical spirit as well. And Kuczynski's book, even though it was by many West German historians immediately condemned as sort of a typical product of Marxist, Leninist pseudo-scholarship, Susanne Miller praised it very much in her book Burgfrieden und Klassenkampf, and Gordon Craig used it in his History of Germany 1866-1945. So Kuczynski's work actually had a lot of positive impact on the road. But the controversy illustrates how volatile things were in the 1950s and how East and West Germany needed to appeal to the past and a particular interpretation of the past in order to expand and justify their legitimacy in the 50s and 60s. Thank you very much.
Just 5 minutes. Like two very interesting papers. We'll follow the usual format again. We'll take 3 or 4 questions and then we'll do them in rounds. So first we'll go here, then there, and then Bill at the back.
I was preoccupied when Robert was giving his paper. There were 2 things. The first was that my impression of Poland is there's a kind of contradiction between Polish nationalism on one hand and the identification of Poland with what was effectively the Lithuanian Empire that stretched all through the Baltics and right down to the Black Sea. And at the same time, I think that in Poland, since 1948, the myth which has dominated is that of the martyr nation. And I wondered the extent to which that contradiction, or those contradictions, were also present at the time of the Second International. In other words, this confusion about what constituted Poland. And my second preoccupation was when you were talking about the Czechs. Because my sense is that at the time of the Second International, that the Czechs considered Czechoslovakia to be their country, and that it's peculiar, or it seems peculiar to me now, that Slovakian identity and nationhood was subsumed into this bigger state.
Thank you. I also have a question for Rory. On the issue of nationalism and the labor movement. I think this is really a very important issue. First, I want to refer to a study by Marcel van der Linden, who's head of research at the International Institute in Amsterdam and published some 20 years ago on. That's still relevant, I think.
No, I mean, just somebody did what I did 20 years ago.
On the development of internationalism, he said, well, the first international is not really comparable to the second international because the first international is a kind of subnational internationalism, which is so-called transnational internationalism. It wasn't about nation states being represented in the international, but it was about trade unions or cooperatives on a subnational level. And the second international we call national internationalism, which is based on the development of national delegations. That's what you said too. So I think it's important to see this development. And then the explanation is that it's also a reflection of the development of the labor market and the welfare state, how the nation became much more important in the labor movement in the 1890s than in the 1860s. So the nation became much more the frame in which labor movements, demands were national trade unions, etc., etc. So the nation became the main framework of organization and also of labor markets. And I think this is continued in the 20th century in a much stronger way. So this is the first remark I want to make, and I think so. Your discussion on this issue of Poland has to do with a much more complex development of this internationalism. The second point is that I don't think you can separate your discussion from further developments of the discussion of nationalism in the international labor movement. So it continues to be an enormous discussion of what a nation really consists. And two examples regarding Poland, we have the Bund, the Jewish nationalist movement, which separates itself from Polish nationalism in a certain way. So they have a definition of nation which is quite different from national state. And then we have the Austrian Empire. And if I remember well, the Socialist Party in Austria was in fact for unification with Germany and with the Anschluss in 1933. Karl Renner, the Social Democratic leader of the Social Democrats, couldn't really oppose this Anschluss from his perspective as a socialist. So this are two examples, and I think you can't separate this whole discussion also from the end. I think the person of Stalin, who wrote an important work, he has to be mentioned, on this issue, is concerning the Russian nationalities, where the problem was, of course, exactly the same. And this whole issue of ethnic definition of nationhood, cultural definition of nationhood, is continuing in the history of the socialist labor movement, and the relationship with nationalism, internationalism, is a continuous discussion. And so I think it's a very interesting story, but there has to be an introduction and a conclusion which relates to these developments of the long run, I think.
Okay, my contribution is extremely closely related to what's just been said. I found Robert's paper absolutely fascinating, and I think it makes some really important points. you can take this distinction between transnational internationalism and national internationalism back even further in time before Van der Linden, the earliest author on international NGOs, like Palmer White, writing in the 1930s, distinguished cosmopolitan international NGOs from, like First International, from international associations consisting of national branches. So what you say can apply not simply to workers' internationalism, but to all forms of private international association. And I think it's a really strong point that I've seen recurring across loads and loads of associations in the 19th and also into the 20th century, this issue of subnational units with claims to national status demanding their own separate institutions. This was a big problem for the International Federation of League of Nations societies, for instance, in the interwar period. I think what you're saying about the way in which you see these demands for subnational entities is kind of fragmentary trend in the development of what might be part of the processes of globalization is a really significant dynamic that provides depth to these arguments about globalization and fragmentation and the way in which they complement each other that hasn't really been fleshed out at all to date in the existing work that I've seen. So in terms of questions, I was just wondering if any of these authors / works are ones that you've related your work to, because I think you shed important new light in relation to the debates that they put forward. These include Glenda Slugo on nationalism and internationalism in the 19th and 20th century, Ian Clark and Geir Lunderstadt on globalization and fragmentation, and Michael Howard's work on war and the liberal conscience, although he also talks about socialists and that kind of liberal banner, and Carmen Abulsi on the 19th century and young Europe, etc. To all of these authors, I think, have put forward a debate in quite general terms. He says something very specific and kind of concrete evidence in relation to that I think is very important.
Okay, and we'll just go to Bill for this last round of questions, and then we'll come in for the next round. We'll start with you, Deborah.
First of all, I'd like to compliment both speakers on very interesting talks. And I have a question that I'd like both of them to consider, and that is if one accepts, at least tentatively, that there's some truth in Benedict Anderson's argument that nations and nationalism are imagined communities. What I'm curious about is what you think of the idea that the Socialist International, in both the Polish and German cases that we've been discussing, served in a sense, as some people have argued, as a sort of transmission belt or organization that helped take an alienated group who didn't feel part of the national community and gave them some sense of having a stake in the national community. So rather than being totally excluded, they now have members in the Reichstag. Instead of having no stake in the society, they are now part of the society, even if negatively integrated. So I wonder what you think of that in terms of nationalism in both cases being conceivably an imagined community, more of a created project than something that just comes naturally. Because I think it's a mistake, at least I believe, for us to think nationalism just comes spontaneously, drops from the sky like avian flu or something.
A good comparison. Let Robert start first, because he's got first.
Maybe I'll just start with your question. I think that was precisely the central point of my thesis there. Especially in Polish historiography, there's this idea of this almost trans-historical Polish nation that existed since the baptism of Mieszko I in 966 up until already, especially the 19th century, is this age where it continued to exist in spite of not having a state, and that actually all of these uprisings, all of the Polish Socialist Party focusing on national independence, it doesn't come like the flu, but it's part of its trans-historical essence of the nation. And what I try to say is that actually that I don't believe this is true. Polish socialism could have evolved into various directions, and for some time it actually looked like it would evolve away from the question of national independence and the fact that it did evolve back to the question of independence is something that we have to explain. And maybe I can use this to refer to your very, very important and very interesting remarks, telling me how much more I still have to read. That, of course, I mean, the reasons why the nation state became important are manifold and complex. And, you know, I have only 20 minutes, and for the sake of argument, I may have overstated my case somewhat. So I'm not saying that this was the main cause. And, you know, the emergence precisely also of the national state as a new framework for socialist activism is also very important. That was actually something that Kellis Kraus, this Polish intellectual I mentioned, that he's witnessed in Germany and France, that actually the nation state can be a very beneficial framework for organizing unions and parties and so on and so forth. But the point is that he saw the nation state precisely as a framework for socialism. Józef Piłsudski, like the main leader of the Polish Socialist Party, once said for him, socialism was a kind of a tram that he only took to stop national independence. So for him, socialism was the vehicle for national independence. But there were important voices within the Polish socialist movement that saw it the other way around, for whom the nation state was the vehicle to reach socialism. The Jewish question always hovers over East Central Europe, and especially over Poland, and makes matters even more complex than I can do justice to in a 20-minute presentation. The reason maybe why I didn't, refer to, all the debates that were going on in the socialist movement on nationalism. I think Lenin would be the first one I had mentioned in his endorsement of national self-determination. But the reason I didn't mention is that actually my approach is more similar, I think, to Thomas's, that I'm less interested, or my primary concern is not the labor movement per se, but the labor movement as an important forum for 19th century internationalism. And in the labor movement we can precisely observe the kinds of make the kinds of observations that you've mentioned. You shouldn't give me a reading list of the authors you mentioned, because to my embarrassment, I have decided I don't know them. I definitely will read your book and will ask you for the names of these. But this is precisely the kind of context I hope to put my project into. Seeing generally the rise of nationalism in the 19th century as, in some respects at least, related to the way in which the world was divided at the time. That the world became kind of moved closer together, but was still divided into separate nations. And if people wanted to have a say in the world, they needed a sovereign state. And that was a context that gave questions of nationalism a tremendous political importance. And that was just as important as, I don't know, domestic factors of ethnic law.
I still find it, in this conference, important to
Absolutely,
relate to the labor movement.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just another example is that the Third International, or the Communist Party of the United States, in the 20s advocated the Black Republic in the southern states. So this is also a way of dealing with nationalism and ethnicity, which of course was not a long period, but you see how the labor movement is, the international labor movement has struggled with this issue of national independence. And
with support for anti-colonial movements was also centered
right.
around national self-determination.
Response for Bill, Axel?
Yes. Oh, sure. I think the approach, Anderson's approach of emerging communities is very helpful, not just in terms of nationalist communities as emerging communities, but sort of internationalist communities would be in some ways emerging communities as well, in as much as, you need to translate material and political and economic realities into a conceptual framework. This goes hand in hand with what you may have alluded to, the interplay between nationalism and internationalism, along the lines of, you can see it in August Bebel, who identified very much with an internationalist tradition, by also saying we're also, of course, very proud to be German. We even identify to some extent with the Prussian state in two things, don't necessarily exclude each other. So the International was definitely a conveyor belt that interacted with the conditions, and but not in a one-dimensional fashion, meaning it often led to sort of unpredictable consequences and results. And concerning this notion of negative integration, of course, it for some people began to change in as much as the support of the party in terms of elections created for certain people a vested interest in supporting the status quo as opposed to challenging the status quo. But all of that had to be translated into a conceptual framework, hence this notion of imagined communities.
Yeah, I forgot your sense. I'm so sorry about that. Kind of Poland and Lithuania and the possible contradictions between them. I think this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was the state that was dissolved in the late 18th century, I think it also illustrates the changes the Polish question underwent, because the Polish nation in the late 18th century was the gentry. And this included a Polonized gentry of Lithuanian descent. Some of the most important 19th century Romantic poet, Adam Mickiewicz, was born in Lithuania, and his main kind of the most important Polish literary work of the 19th century begins with the words, "O Lithuania, my home country." And so this initial the way in which the Polish question was imagined until the late 19th century, when it became ethnicized, was the idea of a commonwealth under the leadership of this gentry nation. And so I'm not sure whether, and this wasn't seen as a contradiction until, of course, other nationalities from the Commonwealth started to imagine themselves as nations like Lithuanians, and then after World War I, it was, of course, a conflict. The other one is Czechoslovakia. This did not play any role in the Second International, to my knowledge, at least, because Czechoslovakia was very much a creation of World War I and an alliance that few people had actually considered. It had never occurred to many people before World War I that there was such a thing as Czechoslovakia. Yeah, generally talking about imagined communities, they could have been. Just as they could be two separate nations, German nations right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm very much for the imagined community.
Right, next round of questions. We've got Deborah, and Francis, and sorry. Okay.
I haven't got I should have picked this up, but I didn't. I'm a bit thick. The difference, you were going on about the different historiography of the East German and Soviet thing, and I got a little bit confused as to what they were in relation to the First World War. I mean, when you say the Soviet side that East Germany was also sort of blaming German nationalism for the origins of the First World War, or was I missing, you didn't say that at all? Because I was thinking of Engels, who in 18, I forget who he was writing to, or what it was, but you'll know it, is when he said that if Tsarist Russia attacks Germany, then Germany must defend itself. And did the East German historians deal with that, or did they deal on the carpet, as is often done in English historiography?
Yeah, my first question would have referred in more general terms to the discussion about Poland. So, but I will make it brief now, only to a very precise point. Because there's just been published a book about the discussions about discussion in the labor movement in the 1920s, European labor movement around a federated Europe, the United States of Europe. In Germany, were there any discussions about a federal solution for Eastern Europe around the Polish socialism? I'm not referring to the Austrian Marxist conception of Renner, but within Polish socialism, Polish language written socialism. That's the one question. The other one refers to the paper on 56, 1918, on Kuczynski. First of all, was there this rejection of Kuczynski's thesis, has this anything to do as an undercurrent with the ill-famed statement, condemnation in 1931 of Rosa Luxemburg by Stalin, with this famous letter to the Protaska Revolucja journal, where he said that no, Rosa Luxemburg had not right before 1940 to criticize the problems of German social democracy and so on. The other thing is, do you know anything about Soviet reactions in 56, 57? There were a lot of Soviet historians working on World War I, for example, Drapkin and others. How would they have reacted? Is there anything, or maybe it's not known, there's nothing published in German or translated to German?
I've got a question for Axel. Because you talked about the West German historiography and the East German historiography as this specific period. What I was wondering is how far was there any kind of dialogue between them? There must be sort of institutional barriers, particularly after the closure of the border in '61, actually getting Western works into the GDR. GDR works were available in the West, but weren't necessarily looked on with really great favour. Were these largely two historiographies debating amongst themselves, but not really saying much to or about each other, except in kind of purely Cold War sense? Or was there any kind of serious interplay between the two? And if so, how did it manifest itself?
Right, well, because we've got another round of questions, hopefully, if we have enough time. So we'll just go with those three for now. So if we let Axel start.
Yeah, concerning your question about the two historiographic traditions, there was some interaction. For example, in the case of Kuczynski, when his book came out, he made a point of forwarding it to the American Historical Review, to various West German historians and historical journalists as well. And he, of course, had access to all the Western literature, was following the Western literature very carefully. He definitely, more so than most other East German historians during that time period, was mindful of the debates in the West, and he sort of addressed his book not mainly to an East German audience, but also to a West German audience in terms of trying to present Marxist historical tradition in the West that is empirical and serious and not just propaganda. I think there probably was a little less openness in the West, and at least in terms of the establishment historians like Gerhard Ritter, who essentially believed anything written on the other side of the Iron Curtain is not worth its paper, so it's not to be taken seriously. Of course, it's different as far as Wolfgang Abendroth is concerned, because Abendroth quotes Kuczynski, so West German historians who were, and political scientists who were outsiders and on the left, they engaged East German historical scholarship. But the usual response in terms of mainstream West German historians was to be dismissive. And of course, in the East, the official response was to look at them as sort of NATO historians, but Kuczynski and others tried to build some bridges. I think your second question related to the Soviet Union. Oh, your question. Yes. Kuczynski got some support from his old friend Eugen Varga, who was not a historian but an economist, who essentially shared his views. Juoza Limsky shared his views as well. but they decided not to get involved in internal East German debates. So they corresponded with Kuczynski privately on that subject matter, expressed their support, but to my knowledge, no prominent Soviet historian publicly supported Kuczynski. Kuczynski, incidentally, was very skillful in trying to manage these kinds of affairs by telling even his supporters to not support him too aggressively and too publicly, because it would just create a counter-reaction from the party. So Kuczynski's strategy of dealing with the entire situation was to recant to some extent, to engage in self-criticism, while at the same time defending the substance of his book. So to show a contrite spirit, but to not, admit to the charge of being a bourgeois revisionist. Does this answer your question?
Yeah.
Sort of.
The other one was about Stalin's 31 position on the termination of Rosa Luxemburg, of the old pre-war social democracy.
Yeah, that definitely played a role as well. I mean, all of these things were sort of highly charged, ideologically highly charged. And well, even though Stalin was now gone for 4 years, the shadow of Stalin was still around, and Kuczynski had to be mindful of, paying lip service to the official interpretation, including the condemnation of Luxembourg, while at the same time testing how far this official interpretation can be now changed and expanded. This sort of answer your question?
It was not explicitly mentioned.
No. But it was definitely in the back of his mind and in the back of the minds of the people who responded to his work positively or negatively.
Regarding the question of an East Central European Federation in the Polish socialist movement,
in order to solve these national ethnic problems.
by a federation,
Yes, kind of.
There's no concept that I know of. Let's put it like this. I mean, Piłsudski was, of course, a proponent of a reborn Polish state that would include most of the 18th century Czech Republic. That would mean large parts of Ukraine and Belarus and Lithuania. But this was, there was a certain federalist idea to this, but it was more seen as in terms of the re-establishment of the Polish state, not as a kind of a federation. I don't know. I don't think so. I've never heard or came across it.
Can you address your question, Katya?
You've forgotten what it is. So
Oh,
right.
yes.
It's all right. I get tired and I'm quite old.
Yeah. Let's see.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Okay.
I think it had something to do with how the East Germans, the official East German perspective on nationalism. The official perspective was, here we have the working class movement, and especially the rank and file working class people are internationalist and progressive and revolutionary, yet the party leadership has misled them and has sort of framed the war also as a defensive reaction against Russian imperialism, but they did not mention that Engels too had grave concerns about that, also because of the, well, at least emotional connection between Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. It was sort of considered to be a minefield to say anything that could be in any way interpreted as anti-Soviet. So that Engels' perspective was not mentioned whatsoever. Of course, people like Kuczynski were aware of it, and Kuczynski engaged it by trying to explain why working class people fell for it, why this nationalism was so widespread because of this notion of, well, Russia is far more reactionary, and sometimes we have to support the lesser evil.
We've got time for just two more questions. So we've got Clem and Heinz.
Two really interesting papers. Just one small follow-up remark on what Robert said on this debate whether the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth played any role. I mean, the one part of Polish social democracy, which Rosa Luxemburg and Leo Jogic was part of, was actually the social democracy of the kingdom, SDKPL. So apparently it was a frame of reference, at least at some point.
Yeah, it came in only later, and initially it was the SDKP, and I actually don't know why they added Lithuania.
Okay. But still, apparently there was some...
Which again, I'm sorry, it shouldn't be...
No. You can address one at a time.
No, go ahead with your question, Sorry.
And not finished. And one small remark to Axel's really interesting paper, which concerns perhaps not so much the Kaczynski case, but in general the dealing with internationalism as such in GDR historiography. I think what we have to keep in mind is that the usage of the term internationalism in general in the GDR discourse is very much shaped to the degeneration that the concept of internationalism has experienced under Stalinism. Because going along with the socialism in one country line, of course, internationalism as a concept got cut off all the globalistic utopian implications. Basically, in the end of the 20s already, in the Soviet Union, internationalism meant, for once, the total loyalty of the international revolutionary movement towards the Soviet Union. Like the famous 1927 statement by Stalin that a true internationalist is someone who supports the Soviet Union and so on. And of course, the second meaning, as in internationalism, as in Völkerfreundschaft, like a friendship of the peoples. And of course, it shaped the GDR historiographic discourse of internationalism a lot. If you look at journal articles like Stefan Dörnberg's Proletarischer Internationalismus und Geschichtswissenschaft, which is basically just about this sort of Völkerfreundschaft and loyalty to the Soviet Union. Or there was now a conference volume, Sozialistischer Internationalismus in 1977, which only deals with this friendship of the people's aspect. So I think, without knowing too much about the specific GDR debates on World War I think still we have to keep in mind that the notion of internationalism was very much shaped to what it has become under Stalin, the sort of reduction.
Especially in the 1950s and 1960s, and things begin to change and become more nuanced as well.
Yeah, a comment and a question to Axel. I read your paper as a contribution to show how politics of memory is contested terrain. And therefore, I would propose to add, and I'm aware of the time restrictions, that the first, or that you can read with respect to East Germany, the story as an expression of the misery of the party and the state brought into the country by the Ulbricht group, because the challenges of Ulbricht started earlier, I would say, with people like Heinz Brandt and Wolfgang Leonhard, who were much more interesting than the people afterwards, because they challenged Ulbricht and then they escaped to the West. That's the first point. Secondly, the 50s, I was asking myself, is it useful to stop in the 60s? Because the 50s and 60s is this time of the Bloch campaign, the Lukács campaign, and the problem of Hans Meyer, and you only have a very limited number of scientists or historians and people in the humanities who dare to protest against the idiots in the party. And I think it was a little bit better in the 70s till the Biermann stuff, and then again later in the breakdown of the system. So it could be of interest, like in the case of Kuczynski, who was on the safe side mostly in the history of the GDR, to see who dared to represent independent positions which could meet the standards of real good science. That's the first. And in the case of the Federal Republic, till 68 it was quite clear that Fritz Fischer was the only exception, or the main exception, because the others were reactionaries and they were all Nazis, especially the fathers of the Bielefeld school, as we observed from Conze to Schieder. And Wehler isn't able to recognize that or to acknowledge that today. So my question would be, what can we learn from the history and the historiography if Historia docet, question mark? Does history teach us?
You want to start?
Well, just remark to this. I mean, that's one remark, of course, that Luxemburg later spoke for Kingdom of Germany, and I think it just there was supposed to be a third speaker on our panel on Luxembourg, and it's really sad that he or she couldn't come, because I think the intriguing thing for me about Luxembourg is that she was this very, internationalist and cosmopolitan internationalist in a sense, and she, at the time of the London Congress, she had been living in Germany for many years and became actually an important figure of the German social democratic movement. But she always insisted on representing actually the Polish working class, and I think this supports, I would say, my argument that the mode of representation was so focused on representing some kind of national delegation that even she could not simply speak for the working class in the Tsarist Empire, or the working class in Europe.
Concerning the periodization, yes, it's complicated because in East Germany, for example, you have freezing up of things 57, 58, 59, and then with the building of the wall you have sort of a second thaw that lasted until the 11th plenum in 1964, where the regime essentially indicated, now we have built the wall, now we can afford to be more open again, and so on and so forth. And as you pointed out, Kuczynski watched these kinds of things very carefully because he was not willing to follow Bloch and Meyer's example of leaving, and he also was not willing to do what people like Fritz Behrens did, meaning to accept that they could not publish anymore and just write for the future, hoping one day their work will become legal and relevant again. So he was remarkably flexible. By the way, the approach he developed, or the concept the compromise he offered was, he said to the party, in particular Hannes Höning, the person in charge of scholarship and science in the Central Committee, that he's going to devote the rest of his life to this big project, 40 volumes of the history of the working class under the conditions of industrial capitalism. And the implication was Kuczynski will not be involved in any politically relevant things. He will write these volumes that will be interesting only to a small set of specialists, so we can afford to leave him alone. And of course Kuczynski knew it would only take him about a decade or so to finish those 40 volumes, and then so he saved himself for a better day and made those necessary compromises. And I think your question was, can you repeat it briefly?
What can we learn from this history? It's a way Kuczynski tried to solve his problem the only possible way. Because my other example would be Wolfgang Heise, the philosopher in Jena, 3 times thrown out of the party, but all times trying to go back. For what reason? Forever.
Yeah. And the case of Kuczynski is also somewhat different because he was not just himself, he was also his Institute for Economic History, which became one of the few internationally respected research institutes in East Germany, and thus he thought strategically in terms of what it would mean to the Institute and to the people who worked at the Institute, so he was very careful not to make things bad for them, and he was mindful, of course, of what happened to Jürgen Teller, Hans Meyer's, and I think he was Bloch's assistant as well, and he was punished once they left and forced to become a blue-collar worker, which is interesting in a worker state to look at that as a punishment. Become a blue-collar worker. Zur Bewährung in die Produktion gestellt, as the official phrase went. Yeah, so essentially...
Taken as an example by the Maoists later on.
Pardon me?
By the Maoists did it later on.
Yes, yes.
Right, great, well that is perfect timing. So I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Robert and Axel. For those of you not coming for dinner this evening, we will see you all tomorrow morning here at 9:30.
Can I say something for social history society? Because some people are going to be here tomorrow. November the 1st, we're going to have a day's conference at Common Hall, and it's going to be on the First World War, but not as you know it. So look out for our information.
Wonderful. Somebody pointed out to me that the first bus from the station to 9:33 or something, is that right? Very bad. So if we'll be here with the coffee from 9, but we'll probably start around about 9:40 just to make sure that anybody will be coming in on the bus. Are there many of you that will be coming in on the bus? Okay. To be fair, we'll start 9:40, 9:45. We won't start at that.
And the first bus goes at 9:30?
No, I think the first one arrives.
The first bus from the railway station was 9. It gets in campus at 9:20.
9 o'clock we have cancelled. So those will have to wait.
No.